Well, we'd like to, again, thank you for joining us. I'm Houma-Thibodaux, Director of Communications for the Diocese of Houma-Thibodaux. Last week, by way of video, we came to you giving you some updates on our intentional plans to return to school. And as I was last week, I'm joined again by Superintendent of Catholic Schools, Suzanne Troxclair, here in the Diocese of Houma-Thibodaux. Suzanne, to start this week, we told them last week that we want to come to them every several days and give them updates on where things stand. To say that this is a fluid situation, that things are literally changing by the day is kind of an understatement. So for this week's installment, I guess I'd like to maybe start with this first. There have been a lot of developments. Quite honestly, we are shooting this on a Wednesday. Our previous video was shot on the previous Friday, 5 days before. A lot has happened in those 5 days, both at the federal level, our vice president here in Louisiana the day before, our governor with some important words back during the weekend, CDC, State Bessie Board yesterday. So why don't we give them a quick update on some things that have transpired within, say, the last 5 days is the last time we were with them and where things stand.
Right. Yes, it's a very fluid situation, Lonnie, and we talked about that from the very beginning. And I think as we need to all remember, this is changing constantly. As our U.S. Surgeon General has said, there's no blueprint for this. So we're in this together. We're all in this trying to make those best decisions. There have been a lot of developments in both our local, state, and at the national level. For instance, we've had some local leaders make decisions about delaying the start of school. We know that's happened in our area of our diocese. We know that the Bessie Board, the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education, just yesterday voted in some specific mandates for all public and approved non-public schools in our state. All of those types of information and those types of developments impact what we do. So from there, we have to take those decisions and those new pieces of information, new guidance from the CDC, that changes very frequently. We take all of those things into consideration and look at where we are now and adjusting our plans. So that's where we are right now. Currently, we are at that point to where we've just gotten some new guidance from our Bessie Board for our schools. So our principals are working with their school teams through our guidance from the diocese to impact their plans for their schools to make sure that we're in compliance where we have to be as a state-approved non-public school in Louisiana.
And if you don't mind, let me ask you one thing, and we're going to move to a couple of other topics in just a moment. We're actually going to revisit a couple of topics from last week. But you mentioned that already there have been at least one announcement of, a pushing back, if you will, of the start of school. People watching us right now and certainly curious. I mean, it is safe to say that decision, at least as far as diocesan schools here, has not been made as we sit here on a Wednesday.
Right. To clarify that exactly. So sometimes that is a little confusing for the general public when they hear a statement from either a public school or another non-public school that is separate from the diocese. We don't all have to do the exact same thing, but with that said, we're all doing what's in the best interest of our students and our staff. So we're evaluating and reevaluating where we are currently with that new guidance that's come out, with new information that comes out from the CDC, what we know we have to do for our schools and our school families to best accommodate them. We have to take all of that into consideration. So today, I can't tell you a different decision has been made, but what I can assure you and assure our public is that we are actively working with those new developments. And as soon as we have a specific decision, if it alters where we are right now in our plan for the start of school, we'll communicate that.
Okay. Now, as we said last week with these series of videos, the idea initially was each week we would take a number of topics and say, okay, what is expected? What is the guidance currently regarding face masks, water bottles, lunch, whatever. And that is still what we're going to do. But there have been so many new developments in the last week. We felt maybe it was more appropriate for the few minutes we have left in this particular video. Why don't we revisit, Suzanne, a couple of topics that we talked about last week, in which I understand there was some follow-up questions, if you will. So why don't we start with face coverings? Now, again, you gave us a good overview last week of what the guidance stated.
Right.
So why don't you give us an update? Not necessarily that there has been new or revised guidance, but just kind of clarifying and reminding, especially parents who are watching this right now, what is expected of their children, not only their children, but our faculty and staff at our schools once we start.
Correct. So to clarify where we are still requiring face coverings, recommending, of course, cloth face coverings for our students in grades 3 through 12 and for all of our employees within our schools. And when we talk about the type of face coverings and cloth face coverings, I want to just give a little background of why you're hearing that over and over in the news and why you're hearing it through these types of sources. Because from the CDC's guidance, they recommend cloth face coverings, for one, because it is something that you can reuse, it can be washed, but also because we want to protect, the CDC recommends that we protect surgical masks and those very specific face coverings for our healthcare workers and our first line responders. We don't want to negatively impact the amount or the supply that they have. We don't want that to go into a critical shortage area. So the CDC recommends the cloth face coverings. We've received questions about face shields, and the CDC states in their guidance that there is no evidence that shows that it is truly it's a good work for source control, what they call source control, from preventing when we cough, when we sneeze, when we speak loudly, from preventing those droplets. They don't have evidence that it's a good source control barrier for us. So we are not allowing face coverings, face shields. For our students or our staff alone. And some people do wear face shields in addition to their face masks as well. Even, for example, one area, students or adults who are hearing impaired or who may need to be able to read lips, that question has come up. How do you adapt to that? And the important part of that is to speak with your physician. If you have a child or if you have an issue where you are concerned about using a cloth face covering, the best thing to do, as the CDC recommends, is to speak to your physician about a proper choice for a face covering. There are some clear face coverings that look like masks, but they're clear, that can be used, for example, for those who are hearing impaired to be able, for the people who are speaking and they may need to see their mouths, to read their lips.
And one final thing before we move to another topic in regards to face coverings, we actually have some good news.
We have some great news. That's right. Our Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness is providing for every student and every school employee in the state of Louisiana for the start of school a cloth face covering. And they're also providing at least 2,000 disposable masks per school and at least 3 thermometers for that needed monitoring, temperature monitoring every day when students and faculty members enter school. So that's great news. The state is really working with our schools, and the Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness is working very carefully to really help do all that they can to make our schools as safe as we can in this time. So that's some exciting news that I was just able to deliver to our schools yesterday as they came from our local emergency preparedness offices. So those will be in place for us when school begins.
All right, and one final thing in regard to that, I know some parents are obviously thinking, regardless of what grade or age level their child is you send a child to school with a cloth face mask,
right.
What happens if something happens during the day? And so that's the importance of those disposables.
And that's why we want the disposables, not just for if a child, soils theirs or forgets theirs, but also for people within the school. We have essential workers that will be very restricted and limited who can enter the school. We're not going to have your typical visitors coming in and out, but there will be people who it's necessary for them to enter school, and we have them for those people as well. So that's going to be a great reserve for our schools to start with, a 2,000 disposable masks as a reserve for them. The schools or really being more specific with their particular guidance for their particular site through their own communication systems and their own plans. You know, we never wanted to put an undue hardship on families by saying you have to buy this particular mask. But what we do want to do is make sure everyone is wearing a mask that is appropriate, a face covering that is appropriate. So your schools will give you more specific guidance for those masks. Some of our schools, we know, were already looking into providing them for their students, but now we know every single student is going to have at least one. So it's important that families keep in close communication with their schools for specific guidance from that school.
And one final thing that again, a matter of revisiting, another item that we talked about last week is that we talked about, I think we called it learning environments, I believe last week. We're very familiar with the traditional way. That's how we all went to school. And of course, we're now almost, we have to say, unfortunately, familiar with virtual learning because that's what we had to do to finish the previous school year. We talked about those two, but there were some follow-up questions that came out of the distribution of our video last week where some were perhaps needing a little bit more clarification, again, depending on when exactly will be the date school starts, and then secondly, what phase are we going to be in our state when that date occurs. So again, maybe maybe a bit of deja vu for me and for you and maybe for some viewers, but the importance that they're understanding those different learning environments.
Right. So we have to be prepared for the possibility of moving to a different phase when school starts. We know currently our governor has us in phase 2. That's where we are now, and there are restrictions for our schools, for our communities in phase 2. But just like we had to prepare in March, we have to be ready again, and in a very intentional way, for if that happens to us in our schools. This time we have a little more time, a little more guidance, or should I say a lot more guidance, in getting ready for that return and that possibility of shifting maybe more than once to another phase. So our schools are preparing for the reality, the very strong likelihood that we will have positive cases. Whether it's at school or at home and a child is positive or an employee is positive, we have to be prepared for that. Learning's not going to stop for those students. We have to be prepared to be able to continue teaching and learning for those students when they're in quarantine or in the unfortunate event that they would actually be symptomatic and be sick. Mm-hmm. So teachers and principals are preparing for that right now and how they are going to continue that curriculum and continue that teaching and learning for those students. Also, we need to be prepared, as I said, if we move to a more restrictive phase. For example, in phase 1, the numbers of students in our classrooms would be cut dramatically. So that could bring us into a hybrid situation where we would need to take students in more of a platooning type situation where we would not be able to have our whole student body present at the same time at school. That would be something we have to be prepared for in phase 1, where we would have learning in a virtual environment along with an in-person environment. That's a hybrid environment. We also need to be prepared for the possibility of a stay-at-home order. In phase 1 with our schools, it doesn't necessarily mandate that no one can be at school, it just restricts the number. However, the governor putting us in a stay-at-home order would change that dynamic, it would change that. So we're also prepared, every school is prepared for their virtual learning strategies if that happens. So we are prepared for all of those scenarios right now.
Right. Well, Suzanne, we want to, again, thank you for joining us. There's a lot more. We'll tell our viewers a lot more topics, obviously, to address. It's a fluid situation, and there's a lot more we're going to be talking about, Suzanne and I, over these coming days and weeks as we prepare for the start of school. Again, we want to thank you for watching us. We want to thank you for your prayers. Our prayers for our children, because right now, if you want to know what priority one is the safe, healthy return of those children and our faculty and staff to those schools.
Right, and if I might add, Lonnie, today there was a White House faith leaders call for our leaders in our faith communities, in our schools and in our churches with the White House. And the U.S. Surgeon General, Jerome Adams, stated today that the best way to keep our children safe at school is to be safe at home. So the best thing that we can all do right now, not just in our schools and preparing for that in-person in-person educating, but also to prepare at home, is to practice those things that we know the CDC has told us, to use social distancing, to wear our face coverings when we are not in an environment that we can maintain our social distance, or when we're out in public, to wash our hands frequently, to wash those surfaces that are frequently touched often. So all of those things we can do for ourselves at home can help us to have a safer environment for our students when they're ready to return to school, and for our administrators and teachers.
All right, thank you again. Great information from Suzanne Troxclair, our Superintendent of Catholic Schools here in the Diocese of Houma-Thibodaux. Lonnie Thibodeau, I want to thank you for joining us again. We hope to have another video with new information on additional topics and, of course, the latest guidance. As we said, things are changing almost daily now, so we want to keep you up to date as best we can. Make sure to always check our website, htdiocese.org, as well as our social media, our Facebook pages, both for the Office of Catholic Schools and, of course, for the Diocese of Houma-Thibodaux. Thank you. See you next time, and God bless you.